we're gonna go ahead and record this presentation.
Thank you.
And with that, I'm gonna pass it over to my colleague, Dr. Kendall, who will be providing an overview of the current state of global EV markets. And we're gonna be talking a little bit more about the recycling opportunities. So with that, Dr. Kendall, take it over.
Well, thanks so much for the introduction, JC, and for doing such a great job of organizing this webinar. We're going to start today by talking about electric vehicles more broadly and lithium-ion batteries and their life cycles. And then we're going to talk more in a global perspective on secondhand vehicle trade and how that shapes our understanding of what the future might hold as fleets in the global north electrify, the global north and China electrify. And then I'm going to hand the webinar over to Francisco, who will take a deeper dive into the U.S.-Mexico trade relationship and implications of the U.S. fleet electrification. And then we'll move to a policy discussion. And we're really looking forward to answering the questions that come up throughout this presentation. So I'm going to start by talking about what global electric vehicle sales look like. And really the story is growth, and more growth. What I'm showing you here is data looking at vehicle sales from 2013 to 2023. And just between 2020 and 2023, we saw a growth of more than 400% in EV sales. That's really an impressive growth. And the other thing we can look at is the regions in which these sales are happening. So back in 2015, sales between China, EU, and the US, which are the main markets for electric vehicles, were about equal. But you can see that over the years since then, China has really accelerated beyond all other regions in EV sales, followed by the EU and then the US. The rest of the world still is smaller than any of those three largest markets, but is growing as well. The regions of sale matter because in this talk, we're really thinking about how places that adopt electric vehicles are moving those vehicles to other countries via secondhand trade. So the way that we try to think about the performance of electric vehicles and what they deliver for us with respect to things like decarbonization and air quality is a life cycle perspective. And in fact, when we think about electric vehicles and deploying them across the world in service of decarbonization, we're really also talking about the deployment of a massive quantity of lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion batteries serve as the energy storage mechanism as well as the power for propulsion for electric vehicles. And they really change the life cycle of vehicles as we understand them. The substitution of engines, for example, by electric vehicle batteries has required the development of new supply chains, new raw material dependencies, and new manufacturing. And then as we use our vehicles, instead of relying solely on petroleum fuels, we now rely on the fuels that make up our electricity grids. And then as we retire vehicles and the batteries that power them, we have a new end-of-life management challenge to address. We cannot remanufacture and recycle in the same ways that we've been able to do in the past with internal combustion engine vehicles. So the way that we've thought about vehicle life cycles, whether they be internal combustion engine vehicles or electric vehicles, really has focused on sort of the assumption that we sell a vehicle in a region and it stays there. But of course, that's not actually what happens. What we see is that there is a really robust trade in secondhand vehicles around the world. And the drivers for this are maybe pushes from high-income countries in the global north, which have roadworthiness and vehicle emission standards that could be challenging or costly to meet, which lead to the availability of these vehicles for trade. We also see things like financing and marketing, which encourage new vehicle purchases in these regions. There's also a pull with respect to global south demand for vehicles as vehicle ownership rises, and a high potential for secondhand vehicle arbitrage. For the US in particular, 30% of the value of light-duty vehicle exports in the country are actually driven by secondhand vehicles. And we estimate somewhere between 5 to 15% of all deregistered vehicles, these are vehicles leaving the US fleet, are actually being traded internationally. So let's go back. Let's think about what this means as we electrify our vehicle fleets in countries in these high-income global north countries. So what I'm showing you here is an estimate we pulled together a few years ago, looking at the three biggest export regions that includes the EU, Japan, and the US. And what given projections for electric vehicle adoption in these regions means for the number of electric vehicles showing up as secondhand electric vehicle exports. What we see is that we will have as many as 2 million vehicles, electric vehicles, in 2035 that have been traded internationally. And by 2050, this number could be as high as 8 million. Now, that's a high range. It might be as low as, say, 4 million, but that's still a whole lot of electric vehicles showing up in countries where they weren't initially sold. And this translates to something between 2 to 4 million tons of battery material as well. And I want to emphasize two things. One, this range that I'm showing you here is probably an underestimate of the real numbers that we see in vehicle trade. And that's for two reasons. One, China previously outlawed secondhand vehicle trade. Only in 2019 did they start allowing small amounts of vehicle trade to happen, and those numbers are growing. And as you saw in our sales numbers, China is the biggest market for electric vehicles. In addition, the work that Francisco's done has illustrated the significant underestimate of US secondhand vehicle trade. And we believe that the similar numbers might be found for example, the EU as well. So let's go back to that electric vehicle life cycle and let's update it given what we understand about secondhand vehicle trade. If we think about the important steps here in the battery life cycle, we have battery or electric vehicle operation and secondhand trade. When secondhand trade occurs, we provide potentially, a service in that trade, right? That you're providing electric vehicles that are lower cost and help electrify in regions that might otherwise not have access to electric mobility. Some of the benefits there are things potentially like reduced air pollution and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. However, we might also be trading in vehicles that really aren't providing the same level of mobility service as desired because lithium-ion batteries that are powering these vehicles may have reduced remaining life, and there may not be great infrastructure for safe disposal. So in the use phase, one of the issues that we see, in addition to the potential benefits of operating electric vehicles, are also the issue of reduced range and performance, and the fact that we can't repair vehicles the same way that we can repair internal combustion engine vehicles. And a lot of times these secondhand vehicles move to countries where they're kept on the road much longer than they would be if they remained in their first country of sale. When it comes to managing batteries from these vehicles at end of life, repurposing is a potential real service that can be delivered when a battery can no longer function in a vehicle anymore because the demands for energy storage and power are very high. We can move those into lower demand applications, things like stationary storage power systems to support renewables like solar panels or microgrids, also grid services, and maybe even other mobility devices that don't require the same amount of energy storage and power that an electric vehicle would require. And then finally, recycling. So the only safe final disposal for batteries is recycling. Global recycling infrastructure is concentrated in the regions that produce batteries, China, and to some extent now growing in South Korea, the European Union, and the US. What this means is many receiving regions of secondhand vehicles don't have recycling infrastructure in place for these batteries. And then the alternative is land disposal, which does present some hazards and risks. So here I'm showing you some images of regions that have imported secondhand electric vehicles. These include a picture of Nissan Leafs in a parking lot in Nairobi, Kenya. These vehicles were imported by a taxi company that operates electric vehicles. And when the batteries no longer function and the vehicles can't be driven anymore, they basically are accumulating in a parking lot because there is no infrastructure for managing these vehicles at end of life. Next to that is a picture of a Tesla in Tijuana, Mexico, where we see a fire occurring due to inappropriate charging infrastructure. This is sort of illustrative of some of the issues of secondhand electric vehicles and vehicle disposal issues, the risk of short remaining battery life, and this inaccessibility to infrastructure, whether that be charging infrastructure or recycling infrastructure. From the perspective of exporting countries, some of the risks associate sort of the leakage of critical minerals in the sense that countries like the EU, regions like the EU, China, and the US are investing in recycling for batteries, but as these vehicles move out of country and leave the region, those batteries are showing up in places without ways to recover those minerals through recycling. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to my colleague Francisco, who's going to really dive into the relationship between the US and Mexico.
All right, well, thank you so much, Alissa. Thanks for that great introduction, and also JC, on how secondhand vehicle trade may shift some of the outcomes of the EV transition. And so now I'm going to go a little bit deeper into the specific US-Mexico dynamic. I'll talk a little bit about the volumes of the secondhand vehicle flows, the characteristics of these vehicles, and discuss a little bit about spent batteries and the associated risks, but also the opportunities for receiving countries, and specifically in this case for Mexico. So one of the most shocking findings that we've had as we've engaged with this research is the degree to which globally secondhand vehicle trade data is notorious for its unreliability. One clear example that I'm really happy to bring to you today, well, not necessarily happy, but in the research sense, happy, that is the disparity, or the disparity in data between US exports data and Mexican import data. So in this graph that you see here, the light blue on the bottom is what the US International Trade Commission reports as exports annually of secondhand vehicles to Mexico. And just for comparison, the darker blue represents what the US International Trade Commission says that it exports to all other countries combined. Now, if we compare that to the import data provided by Mexico's National Customs Agency, we see you can see the difference between not just the exports reported to Mexico, but also generally, in some cases, it's higher than the exports to all other countries combined. Now, if we can add another layer to that, because this is the import data to Mexico, which means it's cars that have been legally registered through an import process to drive in Mexico. However, we've also seen that there are illegal imports into Mexico, or rather not imports, illegal cars that are entered into the country and are driven around without being legally registered. And so we've started to model that, and we have an estimate of that, and that's this red line here. Now, if we clean this graph up a little bit, we can see now, we can gauge a better estimate of what secondhand vehicle annual exports to Mexico from the US really look like. So compared to the blue line, it's about a 30 times the difference. So it's 30 times higher than the blue line, the original export reported to Mexico. And in every year, it's also higher than all the other countries combined. So now that's just for the Mexico case, but if you add up also that data, that number, to the exports to all other countries combined, you can start to understand how exports for the US, secondhand vehicle exports for the US, is a much more interesting issue than it was originally reported. And so because the US International Trade Commission is a very widely cited source, this disparity in the data is cited across different sources, different reports that are very sought after. So we just wanted to point this out. So one of the issues with this is that secondhand vehicle exports and impacts are critically underestimated, and the leakage to Mexico may be underestimated by a factor of 30. Now, using the data provided by the National Association of Customs of Mexico and digging into it, we can see that secondhand vehicles that enter the country are on average about 8 years old. They have an odometer reading of about 150,000 kilometers. They weigh on average between 2,000 kilograms, which that puts them into the category of an SUV or a light truck. And the purchase value is around $2,000. So that really gives you an idea of why, what drives this market, right? So people are driven by the fact that these cars are around 10 to 12 times less expensive than the average domestic new sale they could access in Mexico. So another interesting perspective about the secondhand vehicles is that they're concentrated much more in lower and middle income communities in northern states. And the reason for this is because, well, first of all, and the most obvious reason is because of geographic proximity, but there's more layers to that. The border states, including the peninsula, the entire peninsula, are designated as a border zone. So they're allowed to import secondhand vehicles legally with certain restrictions. Then there are migratory dynamics. So states that have a lot of migrants in the US have organic connections and networks, which they use to also import legally or not legally secondhand vehicles. And also historical urbanization patterns in the north, which differ from the cities in the south, which are much older. Cities in the north and the urbanization in the north has been much more sprawled and car-centric. And so all of those factors combined kind of make it so secondhand vehicles become more prevalent in these areas. So one of the, besides data wrangling, which was what we were just talking about, and cleaning and analyzing, the biggest lift for this project was modeling the fleet dynamics in the US and Mexico using, so we used Mexico's and the US's stated EV adoption goals at the time, along with historical sales, registration, deregistration, and secondhand vehicle imports data. And we created a combined fleet turnover model, which allowed us to estimate secondhand vehicle imports, but factoring in, as Alissa was commenting, both the push effect of the US trying to export cars and the pull effect of the demand of Mexico for those cars. And also, we were able to create projections of annual registrations and deregistrations, and crucially, track the technological composition of these flows and of Mexico's fleet. So what does this all mean? Well, let me just point out that here we're seeing the projected flow of new car registrations in Mexico and the breakdown by technology. So we see ICE, internal combustion engines, starting to fade out as time progresses and being replaced by new EVs, and how secondhand internal combustion engine vehicles also give way to secondhand EVs. And then at the top, we have a little or a big portion of those that we call, I haven't mentioned this, but are the illegal vehicles, the brown color, which in Mexico are called autos chocolate, and that's why we designate them that way, but we will explain that in a little bit. So what does this all mean in terms of the availability of batteries coming into the country? So using this model, we estimated tons of battery mass and tons of valuable recoverable materials becoming available from retired vehicles in Mexico. And unfortunately, this figure is a bit old. This is published in our paper from 2023, but so this doesn't have the illegal vehicles onto that. But already we can see something very interesting, some interesting trends that by 2042, the cumulative mass of batteries from secondhand vehicle imports to the country are more than the cumulative battery mass from new EVs to the country. So, and the reason for that is because they're coming in at a older age, and so they get retired quicker. But then also because their batteries are much larger, as we saw, they're SUVs and light trucks. So that's why that happens. And so because we have the availability of these batteries and the valuable materials that we can recover, we think there's a strong case for bilateral cooperation scenarios to develop a regional critical mineral reintegration supply chain. And Mexico doesn't have the resources, or is not naturally endowed with resources such as the lithium triangle, but it will have a lot of spent batteries. So as we can see, so maybe that's something that we can start thinking about. All right, so let me move on to the second focus of our research, which is modeling the life cycle environmental performance of EVs. So just a brief introduction to that. As we all know, as many can know, the life cycle of EVs has been analyzed many times before. Sometimes people have included the production of these vehicles and the energy use. Some people have modeled a greener grid that powers these vehicles. Some people have included the recycling of these vehicles, and then the refurbishing of the batteries, or the repair of the batteries, and then the reintegration of materials into the supply chain. However, we noticed that nobody had included the secondhand exports. So everybody had assumed that EVs would essentially live their entire life where the original sales was happening. And so we wanted to test what happened if we factored in the secondhand vehicle exports to countries which may not have the necessary infrastructure, resources, or policy frameworks in place to deal with these vehicles. So one of the main barriers that we had to develop this research was that nobody really knows where these batteries go, where these batteries go, or what happens to them, or how many end up in these places. And so what we decided to do to inform our life cycle assessment analysis was that we performed an expert elicitation process. And we conducted semi-structured interviews. We interviewed 27 industry and government stakeholders, including junkyard operators, automotive electricians, dismantling and recycling operators, the E-Waste Recyclers Association, and environmental and waste management officials. And we got a lot of very good information, including these pictures that you see here, which show that these were taken in Mexico, and these show that these batteries and these cars are already starting to enter the flows. So here are some of the key insights. First, that all participants cited salvaged auctions as a source for secondhand vehicles, legal and illegally imported into the country. EVs reaching end of life in Mexico are overwhelmingly from the US, so they are reaching end of life before domestic EV sales. The most common type of electrified vehicle appearing in Mexico now is secondhand hybrid electric vehicles. And one of the reasons that they told me for battery electric vehicles not being more widespread is that there's no infrastructure to charge them. So one of the conclusions that we can think of is as infrastructure for to support EV development in Mexico, to support EV adoption in Mexico develops, then that will enable also battery electric vehicles to come into the country. The most common spent battery chemistry is nickel metal hydride, but we have seen lithium-ion batteries starting to enter these flows. And the battery that we see that's burnt there in the picture is nickel metal hydride, which is good because they're less combustible, but and so maybe that's why we haven't heard of any fires or accidents happening. But as we shift more and more towards lithium-ion batteries, then maybe that can start happening if this issue is not taken care of. So also we saw that there is starting to be an organic development of a maintenance and repair network. They've started to replace modules and perform different kinds of repairing processes. One of the things they've mentioned is that it's difficult to repair because the parts are very expensive. And finally, one of the most important one of the most important findings that we saw is that no official regulations exist for end-of-life EV batteries yet. And because of that, there's no incentives for recyclers to take them. And so people who would deal with these batteries have no other option but to directly landfill them. So with these insights, those insights informed our life cycle assessment process. And here are the key insights of the life cycle assessment. First, that export timing influences a number of different factors, which ultimately determine the life cycle environmental performance of the vehicle. So just as an example, the more time a car spends in the US, the higher its use intensity, so it's going to be driven more, the lower its survival rate, just because of the driving culture, the way a vehicle is used in the US compared to Mexico. But it's going to be used on a cleaner and more efficient grid, and it's got a higher probability of battery replacement and recycling if it remains, the more time it remains in the US. Versus if you export it earlier to Mexico, then it has a lower use intensity and a higher survival rate, but it's used in a more polluting or a less efficient grid. And you can see how this plays out. Now, another very important key insight that we want to stress is that historically, secondhand internal combustion engine vehicle exports have shifted environmental and health burdens to lower and middle income countries. So this green sliver you see here is the benefits that the US receives from exporting a degraded vehicle and replacing it with a new one. And the red is the emissions rates of imports, the increased emissions rates from a degraded large vehicle coming in to replace the average vehicle in Mexico. However, if we start seeing secondhand EVs exports, they will we estimate that they'll reduce operational emissions compared to the incumbent fleet averages. So, and the reason for that is because they come in and displace different vehicles in Mexico. For example, the first bar you see there is if we compare the performance of a secondhand EV to a compact internal combustion engine vehicle, which is the most common car in Mexico. The second bar is the reduction if it replaces a light truck, which is the most common imported vehicle to Mexico. And then if it replaces the same car, so if the secondhand EV replaces the same car just purchased in Mexico. Finally, we see that, as we said, EVs could have a potential to reduce environmental pollution, especially air quality related. However, there remains a concern regarding the toxicity risks of end-of-life batteries because there's limited data on that. And so we think that there is a need for trade partner cooperation in lower middle income countries, but in this case, between the US and Mexico, to establish common regulatory frameworks. And so that finally brings us to our policy discussion. How are we doing on time?
Good.
Yeah,
Go for it.
okay. So we organize it like this. We think that there are certain things that Mexico can do, there are certain things that the exporting country can do, and then there are certain things that there could be cooperation to do together. So in the case of the importing country, specifically Mexico, there needs to be a development of a circular battery economy strategy. So implement incentives and different industrial policy mechanisms to promote the collection, the recycling, and battery second life applications to deal with the end of life and the repurposing of these batteries, and kind of create pathways to reintegrate these materials into the supply chain. Then another important one is, because these vehicles mainly are concentrated in lower income communities in northern Mexico, we think it'd be strategic to deploy charging infrastructure and grid decarbonization for communities that rely on these vehicles to be able to easily or to more efficiently make the transition from ICE, internal combustion engine vehicles, to EVs. And finally, continue with import regulations, which is something that Mexico has done for a long time. But we can, in this case, we can promote, or rather facilitate, EVs while restricting internal combustion engine. And that way the benefit, the air quality benefits, and all of the efficiency benefits of EVs could be maximized, while the burdens can be minimized. For the US, because we saw that the main source of these vehicles for people in Mexico are salvage vehicle auctions, we think that international sales data transparency and reporting could be an important component to starting to regulate and get a hand of these flows. And also, there's a number of different things that can be implemented to support the domestic demand for these materials and these cars, like incentives for domestic reuse or resale of the parts. Then implementing export mechanisms such as state of health requirements, adopting right to repair legislation, which a number of states have started to propose. Some have implemented, such as California, but that can be more widely adopted. Then joint actions can look like cooperation for regional battery recycling infrastructure and supply chains. There can be shared investments to develop these the recycling infrastructure, or reverse logistics networks. And then one low-hanging fruit that I think, but I think, you know, one thing is to say it and one thing, and the different thing is to implement it, but harmonizing secondhand vehicle trade records. So as we saw at the beginning, imports in Mexico look completely different from exports in the US. So just sharing that information could be very valuable and helpful to this work. Then creating a shared database platform to track battery state of health, similar to the proposal of the EU's digital battery passport, would be very effective. And finally, collaborating to develop regional extended producer responsibility. And that could also not be regional, it could be in the production countries, but you know, there's different approaches. All right, well, finally, I'm very, very proud to present the last piece of the work that we've been doing for this research. So far, we've been analyzing the data and experiencing the dynamics from more of a high-level perspective of the regional secondhand vehicle dynamics. However, the more we talk to people on both sides of the border, the more we realize that we needed to include the perspective from people on the ground, what this dynamic looks like in real life and who it impacts directly, what it means for people's day-to-day lives, their livelihood. And the reason is because this is actually the engine that drives the entire market. So we really wanted to go above and beyond the traditional outreach channels and create something that would be much more engaging and relatable. So we set off to create a short documentary, which will be available by the end of April of this year. But I have a trailer for you. And so without further ado, I have the great pleasure of releasing the trailer to our lovely audience today. So
For the first time.
For the first time, yeah, this is the premiere. So enjoy.
Un carro chocolate es una modalidad del carro importado a México proveniente de Estados Unidos que no se ha registrado de manera legal en el país para manejarse. Se les llama así porque en México a las cosas que son informales o ilegales les decimos chuecos, como torcido. La palabra suena a chocolate y entonces les empezamos a decir coloquialmente autochocolate. Tanto en Estados Unidos como en México hay metas de electrificar la flota. Para el 2035, en Estados Unidos la meta es el 100% de los vehículos que se venden al año sean eléctricos. En México también tenemos una meta similar, sin embargo está recorrida un par de décadas en el futuro. Lo que creemos es que a la par de que se desarrolle la infraestructura para acomodar o dar servicio a los vehículos nuevos, pues también se van a ir pudiendo utilizar vehículos usados, importados de Estados Unidos, ¿no?
Soy técnico especializado en autos híbridos eléctricos. Tengo clientes de carros que son del año y también tengo clientes que su vehículo es año 2000. Bajo mi experiencia, el 60% de las fallas vienen de las baterías. Estamos hablando de vehículos que ya tienen más de 10 años, 15 años. Todo tiene solución. Reemplazamos celdas para economizar al cliente y obviamente para que el vehículo pues, se pueda mover, ¿no? De otro modo, una batería es sumamente costosa, más costosa que el vehículo. Ahorita las baterías de los carros eléctricos son baterías muy grandes. ¿Y qué va a pasar con ellas? No tenemos ahorita dónde tirarlo, pues la verdad, eso es un gran problema porque yo ya tengo muchas celdas y no sé qué hacer con ellas. Si nosotros tenemos un vehículo, se nos prende uno, yo no lo voy a poder apagar.
Si estas baterías simplemente se dejan sin tratar, pues puede resultar un problema para la población, ¿no? Y la batería tiene una cantidad de minerales y materiales para los cuales no estamos preparados para recibirlos, ¿no?
Why Americans should care about this is because we're losing a lot of resources through this export and leakage system. That the system is making it very difficult for domestic auto dismantlers to compete. There are a lot of people who depend on auto dismantlers to buy more affordable parts when they're to get their cars fixed. And so they are losing access to those vehicles and that supply of more affordable replacements as well. But we do not currently have any regulation that's actually clearly saying what should happen to end-of-life EV batteries and who is responsible for that.
Okay. All right. Well, I really hope you enjoyed that. That was the world premiere. So you saw it here first. Before I pass it on to JC, I just want to say a big shout out to Hatay Films. They are the producers, or not the producers, the director and the producing agency. They're fantastic to work with, and I'm really appreciative of them. All right.
Thank you. Can you end the screen, the share on your side?
Yeah.
Oh. All right. Thank you, Paco. Excellent work. I know this has been a long time coming with your dissertation and your work. Also should mention, Paco recently submitted his dissertation still, but already a big accomplishment with that. Paco, I just want to mention there is some folks in the chat that have, in the Q&A that have mentioned, reach out to them once this is final because they'd like to share it broadly in some of the Mexican newspapers.
Oh, perfect. I'd love to.
Yeah. So at this point in the conversation, we want to switch to more of a dialogue. We want to tee up some of the questions that have been filling up in the chat, and want to ask again to folks that are attending to please make sure to send us your question. If we don't get through to them via this platform, what we can do is ultimately reach out to you via email and try to answer some of your questions. We do have some initial questions that I think we want to tee up, and we want to get the conversation going that way. And then we'll shift over to some of the questions in the chat. Let me briefly provide some additional instructions for folks. Si tienen alguna pregunta y quieren hacerla, pueden ponerla en la caja de Q&A. Aún si es en español, nosotros la podemos traducir y podemos aquí contestárselas. All right. With that, I want to start off with you, Alissa. You shared some of your work around various recycling chains, some of the various features that exist within it. And I think one of the big questions is are there examples of or industries out there, maybe even countries, where the recycling of these components, of these materials, is done in an effective way, in a way that makes sense, maybe even in a environmental friendly way that is efficient and that promotes this circularity that we're trying to get at? And what from those strategies can this binational cooperation try to emulate?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. It's a really good one. I think one thing to say is that the US itself doesn't have any policies that require or regulate the recycling of end-of-life batteries in any way, which indicates that we're sort of depending on the market, the economics of recycling to give us the answer. And the reality is that it's not really going to give us what we're looking for. And I'll give you two reasons why. One of the valuable materials that are in batteries, namely nickel and cobalt, are basically getting designed out. Partly because it reduces the initial cost of batteries, and lower cost batteries mean lower cost cars, right. Which I think all of us would prefer. And then also, when we do recycle a battery, the decision to recover different parts of the battery is purely market driven. So even if I recycle a battery today and it goes to a recycling plant, and the nickel and the cobalt and the copper are all taken out and recycled, the lithium, for example, stays in the slag. It's not being recovered. I point this out because I think the region to look at probably is the European Union. The European Union has instituted a battery regulation that has thought hard about sort of the problems of relying on sort of a purely market-based system. And so what they've designed is a recycled content standard to have a market pull to say, hey, recycled materials are valuable, and maybe give those recyclers a premium for the materials they cover. But they've also have an extended producer responsibility requirement that requires that the batteries be collected and that they go to recycling plants that have the performance to be able to pull out all of the critical minerals, and not at 100%, but that they have to be able to pull out some percentage of the lithium, for example, and a large fraction of the other valuable minerals in there. So, so we can look to the EU battery regulation as potentially as a guide. Now, the EU regulates multiple countries who are all partners. And so it'd be great to think that in North America, that we could all be partners. And I think recent events aside, we have seen an amazing amount of cooperation and cross-border investment on vehicle manufacturing in general. The automotive industry seems fully integrated from a manufacturing perspective. And if we can do the same thing on the end of life of vehicles, I think that we could get really far in really great solutions.
Let's not get there yet, but we will come back to this last point that you mentioned. So, Paco, over to you. You know, it was briefly mentioned in your talking points and briefly mentioned by Meg in the trailer, this idea that, you know, the used flow of vehicles between the two countries, between Mexico and the United States, is something that we should consider not just as a concern or as a benefit for Mexico, but also as a concern and benefit for U.S. consumers. And I guess the question is, why should somebody in the United States, why would a U.S. consumer want to have this binational policies? Why would they want to have this collaboration between the two countries?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm glad you asked it because it's something I've been thinking about for a while. So there are many stakeholders involved in this trade, right? It's not just people in Mexico that randomly want to go buy a car, right? There needs to be an infrastructure in place and people that make their livelihoods from supplying these vehicles, right? So there are many people who are involved in this network to make it work. And so the secondhand vehicle exports for the US represents $1 billion a year market. There are, you know, the salvage auctions, I know of people who their businesses to take apart the vehicle parts and export that, not just as a car, but as the actual parts. And so that's one part of it. The other part is what Meg was alluding to in the teaser, which is that the fact that this market is becoming increasingly online has enabled it to more people across the world to be able to access these materials and these cars from the U.S. market. And so it makes it so domestic maintenance and repair networks can't access these parts, these affordable parts as easily. So it increases the price for regular consumers to be able to fix their cars. And I'm sure that more than one person on this call will be very familiar with, you know, the crazy price tag that if they didn't have insurance, they wouldn't be able to pay. So this is not the only thing that, you know, drives up the prices, but it is something that that factors in. And finally, well, I'll leave it at that. I forgot my last one.
No worries. That was good points. I have a number of questions prepared.
Oh, sorry. Can I go back?
Yes, absolutely.
I remember, and this is the one that we've been talking about the most, actually. I made a point of remembering the ones that are less mentioned. The one that we talk about the most is if we are exporting, you know, these cars and they're increasingly EVs, which have the battery in there. And the policy in the US is to be able to secure as many critical minerals as possible. This is kind of a leakage point for these critical minerals. And so there's an incentive there to try and kind of keep track of that and to be able to, you know, make the most of that supply chain. And so trying to cooperate with Mexico, who receives most of the secondhand vehicle exports from the US, to create this supply chain would be beneficial to reintegrate those batteries into the battery supply chain for the US.
Social benefits, environmental benefits, benefits to the consumer as a whole. So a whole host of opportunities there.
Correct.
Again, I have various questions, but I can see that the Q&A is filling up. We're at 25 questions. Thank you all for dropping in your questions. We're going to shift to some of the questions that you all have sent us here. And why don't we start with the question here from Jorge Carlos Morgan Medina. Really interesting question here, and maybe going to catch you here on a whim. Which do you think is worse for the environment? The hard to recover and often useless disposal of an electric car once the battery is dead, or the smog from normal cars, which I'm assuming internal combustion engine vehicles, release along its useful life of 15 to 20 years? Interesting question.
That's a good question, and it's something that we've also been wondering about. According to the LCA that we did, the EV performs better than the internal combustion engine vehicle across the life cycle.
Yeah, maybe I can speak to the resource question. So deciding, thinking about different kinds of environmental impacts and deciding which environmental impact is sort of worth more to somebody is a really big challenge. But I can say that if with respect to an electric vehicle operating in an urban environment with poor air quality, the benefits of operating EV are immense. Even if we, for example, put it in terms of the cost of healthcare, the cost of illness and shortened lifespan. So there are some real demonstrable benefits from electrifying fleets, especially in urban areas or high density areas. So I think there is a lot of benefit to be gained. What I hope for is that we don't have to make that choice. That what we can say is, hey, it's really worth electrifying, and if we are strategic about it, we can actually ensure that that vehicles and batteries that end up anywhere in the world, but certainly in Mexico from the US, we're able to recover safely, manage them at end of life and recover those minerals and minimize the harms of mining, which is one of the goals of a more circular battery material flow. So in my mind, there are lots of evidence that EVs are worth it with respect to the environmental gains that we make. And we shouldn't allow sort of the problem of the battery to be a problem. We have time to act. The flows aren't really there yet.
Yeah.
We have time to anticipate, and it's a rare occasion that we can anticipate environmental problem and set up, an effective way to manage it.
Yeah, I think the way to think about it is, the batteries, if you figure out how to manage them at the end of life, could be a benefit. But if you don't pay attention to them, then it could be a problem.
Yeah. Interesting question, maybe alluding to your point, Alissa. This question is coming from Victoria. I'm gonna butcher it, Plume. Is the technology to recover and recycle critical minerals from EVs currently available at an industrial scale? So
Yeah.
could folks make use of these components and EV batteries to the degree that they are effective and efficient and can be reused?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are different technologies for recycling. And in general, the recycling that's being built today are hydrometallurgical facilities. And those types of recycling facilities are capable of recovering at very high rates all of the critical minerals that are in batteries. So the answer is yes, those are commercial. They've been built at industrial scale and they happen. There are technologies on the horizon that are even better. There's a pilot facility, for example, in North America, doing something called direct recycling, where you can more efficiently recover more of the materials, especially those critical materials, in a form that doesn't require as much refining and processing after recovery. So we can keep improving, but today, no doubt, there are industrial facilities that are built and in place that can recover minerals at high rates.
Thank you for that. There's a few questions that touch on something that we haven't discussed in this particular presentation today, but Paco and I had a chance to connect with folks on the heavy duty end of things, right? And that also is a concern. And there's quite a few questions here that are popping up about we're talking about passenger vehicles here, but could these same concerns, maybe the strategies, apply to the heavy duty sector? We're talking about larger battery packs. We're talking about larger vehicles. Could it not? Maybe this is for future research, right? But opportunities there to apply some of these findings, some of these policy collaborations, binational policy collaborations to address the shifting or the flow of heavy duty vehicles.
That's a great question. I think we have seen flows already happening, not so much from the US, but out of Japan and China and South Korea to some extent, moving, for example, buses that are electrified to other countries. I'm sure Paco has more to add to this, but my intuition here is that actually those are much easier to manage, and I'll give you two reasons why. One, you have a lot of fleet operators who will have the opportunity to familiarize themselves much more with the technology and potentially have the opportunity to do, to repair and maintain a bit more. But also you have these very large packs that when they can no longer be operated in the heavy duty vehicle are ripe for repurposing. And we see a lot of strategies of different sites where battery packs are being used to provide on-site power storage, to assist in managing power demand during charging, things like that. So I do think there are a lot of opportunities there. And I think a lot of the world is looking to, for example, buses for electrification rather than cars. And in some ways, I think they actually are easier to manage than cars. I don't know if you have more to add here.
Well, two things. One is that one of the bigger challenges of the logistics of recycling batteries, of the reverse logistics, so trying to recover all these batteries and put them in one place and then recycle them to make it like economically feasible to do, is the transportation of the batteries. And so because they weigh, I don't know, 400 kilograms each, it's hard to move, it's hard to, then you have to wait for a bunch of them to be able to make it economically viable to transport, etc. And they're dangerous, they could catch on fire, so they have a bunch of restrictions that you have to abide by. So the transportation is a little bit of an issue, especially for passenger cars, because they're more spread out, right? They're individuals. But for fleet and for freight, they're already within this network they're part of a fleet, basically. So they have a manager, and so all of these batteries belong to the same company, and so they're able to manage them easier. Like the logistics is easier.
Right.
And the other thing is, let's talking specifically about freight. Well, they already have the trucks to ship them, right? So in that sense, maybe it makes even more sense to do it for heavy duty.
Absolutely. For this particular question that I'm looking at, I see, which this would be a great question for Meg as well, who looked at the Lithium Valley, right? But this is something that, as a whole, I think California is looking at. I'm trying to address the anonymous attendee question, who wish we could have a little bit more insights on this from other folks. But yes, in brief, yes. The question is, do you see any opportunities for partnerships between the projected lithium jobs that will emerge in Imperial Valley, which is right on the border, and Baja California? Before I pass it over to my colleagues, there is already discussions about collaboration among the two subnational governments of Baja and California. This is something that is a key focus to address not just the social, the environmental concerns, but then these cooperations around workforce, right? But I think there's a whole host of other opportunities in the specific region, given that it will be a hotbed for what's to come within the electrification space. So thoughts?
Do you want to go first? or-
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to go first but a lot of what I've learned has been from you.
Okay, I'll go
Oh.
first then. Yeah.
Go for it.
So, Lithium Valley is very interesting because it has the lithium in brine form, and that's easier way to extract. It's cheaper than extracting it from what do you call it?
Hard rock.
Hard rock, but then there's the other,
In volcanic clays.
the clays.
Yeah.
So it's a more kind of benign form of the resource to have. It's what they have in Chile a lot, and why it's so why they're so optimistic about the lithium potential. It turns out that Lithium Valley is part of the same geological kind of area as Mexicali, which is across the border, and they also have this resource, and they have a giant 720 megawatt geothermal power plant operating there since the 70s, and they have been having to deal with lithium before it was worth anything. And so to our understanding, there's knowledge there that can be tapped. Other than that, Mexicali is the largest, is the state capital, so it has all the political infrastructure in place, but it's also a very industrial area. It grew out of industry. That's why the city is there. And so and there's 2 million people, whereas across the border in Lithium Valley, they're all agricultural small cities. And so we definitely see a lot of cooperation kind of points where some parts of the processes can be done in Mexicali more easily than in Lithium Valley. Something that would kind of throw a wrench in it is, the tariff situation. But, other than that, we think it would be highly beneficial, and we've talked to some people and they're interested in the potential.
Yeah, and to add to that, there has been some vision in the California side of this idea of leveraging what could just be lithium production into sort of a manufacturing hub, where you'd go from lithium all the way at least to battery cells. And one thing I'll point out is that recycling infrastructure is or recycling plants are almost always co-located with manufacturing. And from what I understand, Mexicali also has a history of being, of having a lot of recycling industry as well. So we could see some kind of virtuous circle here where you are able to co-locate or locate there nearby manufacturing and recycling, which really go together and make the value proposition for recycling better as well, and could address some of the challenges or problems of secondhand vehicle exports to Mexico. So I think there could be a really, really integrated approach that solves multiple problems and brings jobs to both regions in a way that could be valuable. We need to say, of course, that the region is already sort of, at least on the U.S. side, is which I'm more familiar with, definitely has some challenges with respect to existing problems for air quality and water availability. So we need to move forward, acknowledging those existing conditions and making sure that it's done right. But I think there's a huge opportunity to do it right and for both sides to benefit.
Yeah. So sorry, just to add a short thing there. As I said, Mexico doesn't have, the resource of the lithium triangle, but it will have a lot of batteries. And one of the regions that will have more batteries than anywhere else in the country is, behind Mexicali. The video that we showed is Mexicali. So it makes a lot of sense to kind of start thinking about those co-locations of those industries.
Maybe this is a good time to address the shifting dynamics that you have alluded to, and that some folks in the chat have already asked and raised. So before we jump into that specific question, maybe providing a bit of context as far as the border region itself, as you mentioned, Paco, also in your remarks, Alissa, the border region itself is in an area where there is cities on both sides of the border that consistently have social networks, economic networks, manufacturing networks, right? We're talking about cities that are separated, yes, by the border, but in fact share a lot of the similar economic drivers that drive them. A lot of the times from Mexico towards the U.S., new products moving in that direction, and then used products going into Mexico, right? With the looming concern that tariffs may come up in the next week, how would this affect some of the work that has been discussed already, whether that's the vehicle trade flow, whether that is the collaboration that is intended to occur among some of these sectors? What is the forecast?
Do-
High level.
I've got, and well, first of all, let me start with the secondhand vehicle flows.
Yeah.
What we've seen is, and as I showed in the graphs, historically, Mexico has definitely tried to regulate secondhand vehicle imports. However, because of difficulties and the dynamics of the trade, etc., secondhand vehicles have continued to enter the country because illegally or legally. And when I say illegal, I don't mean because a lot of, and I want to clarify this because a lot of people ask me about this here. I don't mean they've been stolen or anything and taken over the country, taken over to the country. No, I mean they purchase them at these salvage vehicle auctions, and then they drive them down to Mexico and then just don't import them. They just don't register them. That's what I mean. I want to clarify that because I don't want to cause any controversies. So they've been doing that for a long time. And so we see that when legal imports go down, illegal imports go up. So even if the tariffs come in place, we assume that we'll still see a flow of vehicles one way or the other. Now that said, in terms of the cooperation scenarios, I do see it being affected by tariffs because if it applies to 25% to everything, including parts, including materials, including anything that crosses the border one way, then, for example, this hub that we're dreaming about, maybe there's no business case for it because one of the main benefits of manufacturing in Mexico is the low cost, right? And if that's not there anymore, then maybe there's no economic sense to doing that kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think that's spot on. And I also think, if there are tariffs put on the US side, and then if equal tariffs are put on the Mexico side, it is possible that even the flow of any sort of legal trade in parts and everything else would also stop, right? So it would have, I think it would have a dramatic effect on what the current end-of-life processes look like as well for vehicles, not just sort of the industrial development side, which would definitely be highly affected.
In general, I think.
No, can I
absolutely.
add one more thing?
Absolutely, yeah.
I think that you're right, but I still think that cars would keep coming in anyways, and so batteries will be a thing anyway, regardless of the tariffs. So Mexico should still think of all of the policies that we talked about, but maybe would have to look for other places to I guess other customers, right, to sell the product.
Different market. And kind of to that last point, it's been brought up consistently here, this idea of stop manufacturing internal combustion engine vehicles in Mexico, shift completely over production in the various Mexican-based OEMs, shift completely to electric. Why should Mexico and the industry in Mexico begin to shift into electric mobility? One big concern is that there isn't yet that infrastructure. I think that's the same case in various parts around the US, but I guess the case for shifting or beginning to shift in that direction away from maybe internal combustion engine vehicles, maybe used ICE vehicles, and shifting the industry more towards EVs. Why begin to take those steps in that direction towards electrification in that transport sector?
Well, I hear two questions. One is sort of like the domestic consumption of vehicles in Mexico, right? As well as, you know, the manufacturing and exports. I think, I'm not an expert on Mexico policy, but I think the benefits of electric vehicles, we've sort of described some of them, the air quality benefits, and also the greenhouse gas benefits. I do think in terms of Mexico being a net exporter of vehicles, I know that Paco can offer a lot of insights on sort of what is currently produced in Mexico and what that means. But certainly, you know, the markets, the non-US markets that Mexico sends vehicles to are rapidly electrifying and are, you know, Europe, for example, with its targets. And so if you don't switch over your manufacturing capacity, if you still keep focusing on ICE vehicles, sure, there'll be some markets there for the next 25 years, but you are missing out on a lot of the, you know, a lot of the markets which are looking to electric vehicles. And Mexico is, you know, has a really expert, you know, like employee base, labor pool to draw from. And so, you know, moving towards a higher tech vehicle, moving towards this manufacturing early seems like a strategic move, at least from my opinion, with the caveat that I am an engineer and not not a business or expert on this. But I want to pass it to you because I know you know more about sort of which vehicles are produced now in the markets for Mexico's exports.
Yeah. So currently there's already a couple, I want to say 4 EV models and PHEV models. So 4 in total. I don't know the split. And including the Mustang Mach-E, for example, they send about like 200,000, I think, to the US. But then there's a big market in Germany for Audi's Q3, I want to say. Maybe I'm botching this, but so there definitely is an intention to shift to electric vehicles. I think the producers just need to see that there will be like a consistent demand. And because the US is the main market for, let me cite this, about 70% of Mexican production goes to the US. So if the US is stalling, then producers in Mexico won't necessarily want to produce that much. But everybody's kind of waiting, it's a wait and see game, right?
Till next week.
Yeah, but what Alissa says is absolutely correct. So every market, slowly or fastly, is shifting to EVs, and so everybody is expecting to shift. So lagging behind does nobody any favors. And I do want to say that Mexico has on a federal policy to produce small EVs. It's a project called Olguin, which was announced by the Sheinbaum administration maybe at the beginning of this year. And the idea is to kind of develop its domestic market for EVs, to producing a smaller car that's tailored to the needs of the Mexican market. And then from there, once you have that, then you can also access maybe other big markets in Latin America who have similar needs than Mexico. So there is that kind of, you can see where things are heading.
There's emerging markets elsewhere that Mexico can likely become prime producer for.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay, we're getting here to the last 10 minutes of our discussion. I want to turn it back to the research side here. And I know, Paco, you've been doing quite a bit of research over the last few years. Alissa, you've been looking at this stuff for quite some time as well. in doing this research, specifically doing this focused research on used vehicle flows, and Paco, maybe for you, as you're doing some of these interviews as well, is there something new that you've uncovered, something that you thought could spark a new research question that perhaps you didn't have time for, but opportunities for further research in the future that you would like to continue exploring, whether that's again through your interviews or whether that's the consistent work that you've been doing, Alissa? So, question for both.
Okay, I'll go. Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe that's the nature of doing research, right? You go down one rabbit hole and then find a bunch of others, and then you never stop, or you have to stop because then at some point, right? Yeah. So for me, it was a few different things. One of them, we have two kind of research paths in the pipeline. I don't know if that's the way to say it, but so some of the numbers that we showed the audience today about autos chocolate or the illegal vehicles hasn't been published yet, but we are looking to do that very soon. So doing kind of a more focused approach on that, and what the additional demand for those cars or the additional exports from the US would mean for US recycling investments, for example. That's one thing that we're interested in. Then we also haven't published the interviews. We've been using them for a lot of parts of our research, but we haven't done the kind of the specific mapping of the stakeholders and the policy framework, and that's something that I really want to do. Another big one that's kind of I have two pieces of research that I really want to get to. One is there's no clear data on battery impacts if you don't dispose of it correctly. So we have anecdotal kind of evidence. We know that, yeah, if you let a battery sit in the sun uncovered, this is what everybody says, it can start leaching toxins, and it can catch on fire. That's basically what everybody says. But we don't have a way to quantify it yet. So that, I think, would be a very specific quantitative thing that we can look at. I'm not going to look at it, but if somebody does, that's there. I think that would be very helpful for everybody. And finally, I think there is a lot of interesting data and insights to be gained from salvage vehicle auctions and their dynamics, and that we started to kind of scratch the surface, but we haven't even started with that. So I think that would be very interesting to look at as well.
All right, this is folks on the call. I'm gonna come back to you. Folks on the call, anything that Paco discuss, if you have ideas, if you have places to start, feel free to drop information in the chat. We'll make sure to follow up with you. Alissa, any other interesting aspects of this research that you want to follow?
So I'm gonna sound like a professor now, but I think what's been really different about this research is that kind of early in the process, we realized both in our analysis of US management of end-of-life vehicles and now in the secondhand trade space as well, that the official information that was out there basically didn't exist. And it was rather fascinating to realize that no one had documented any of this. Right. It was also important to realize that our sort of quantitative engineering approach wasn't going to work. And so, using interviews, using expert elicitation, asking the people who are, interacting with and touching the very objects that we're trying to analyze was really important. And I think we could build more of that into our work. And other fields have done this perfectly well. They know they have to talk to people. But in this case, I think it's not where people start. So this work has changed how we approach doing, say, life cycle assessment or even policy analysis, where now we start with those interviews, we start with those questions to build understanding. And I think that for any markets that aren't sort of like, I think of markets that are like highly regulated and things where you have all this data and this information, that's actually not the majority of our markets in a way, right? So we need to do a much better job of these like sort of mixed methods approaches. The other thing I wanna sort of highlight here is that Paco's work is the first to really try to quantify a lot of this and to use these interviews. This should and can be replicated in other parts of the world. We know that there are land frontiers leaving Europe, for example, where there is a lot of secondhand vehicles moving out. And we have a lot of evidence that there isn't a lot of documentation or understanding of exactly what's happening. This could be replicated in those regions, and I think it's valuable. And then the last part I'll add to here is that I think that this speaks more broadly to the challenges of waste management in our technological age. And we have not fully addressed the problems of e-waste. We have not addressed the problems of, photovoltaic panels, whatever they are. All of these changes to our economy, all of which are really important for a more sustainable future, are also enormous challenges on the waste management side. And so I think that that is a new frontier of work that must happen. And I think that there's learning to be shared across all these different markets. What's being faced, in a place like Hawaii, where transporting waste batteries is really challenging. You have to get it on a boat. That requires a lot of safety and other kinds of hazardous material requirements, is also being faced by small island nations. It's also being faced by countries across Africa that depend highly on secondhand vehicles. And so all of us coming together to try to tackle this problem, I think is the future, and working on connecting and translating the work across these different geographies is going to be a next step as well.
Yeah, and sorry,
Cool.
and just to add to that, which was a fantastic point, is we've been looking at Mexico because it's very highly relevant to us. We live on the border, or well, very close to the border. The relationship with the U.S. is important, etc. I'm from Mexico, but Mexico is actually, the secondhand vehicles as a proportion of the total fleet is about 25%, about, or 27, yeah. But in some places, like Alissa was mentioning, in Africa, it's 90%, like the entire,
99%,
basically
yeah.
entire fleet. So and Mexico has a very strong industrial base. Like and it's a big country. It has 130 million people, so it's well set up to deal with these kinds of challenges. There's other places that are not as well set up, and so it'd be even more critical to look at that kind of those dynamics.
Well, hopefully through these continued collaborations, more research like yours, we can develop a strong framework to Mexico can become a model of how to address and tackle some of these issues. We're here in the last minute. Spitfire, I know that Paco, you have your documentary that's about to be out. If you want to tell folks and remind folks once again when it might be coming out and where they can find it.
That's a really good question. We still don't know where it's going to be placed, but we're working on it. It's going to come out at I think April 28th. And I think a good approach is whoever subscribed to this list, we're going to send it out. And please reach out to me. You can email me, and you'll have I'm sure you'll have my email, and we can work something out.
You don't mind pulling up those last two slides. Yeah. For folks that are still with us, thank you. This was an excellent discussion. We had a lot of activity, a lot of questions, unfortunately, that we did not get to. We would do our best to try to circle back with those of you that provided questions in text. The QR code that you can see here is to be added to the ITS listserv, the Institute of Transportation Studies here at UC Davis. You can get more information about events like this in the future. If you can go to this next slide real quick. Our next webinar is going to be in a month's time. We're going to be looking at more specific aspects of EVs, and we're going to invite my colleague Wu Dong to participate and present her work on cost and sensitivity and charging choices of plug-in electric vehicle drivers. So more of behavior study, but looking forward to that conversation as well. If you can go back one slide so folks can see that QR code again. Again, if you are still interested in being engaged with us, feel free to scan this QR code and continue participating in activities like this, or reach out to us directly. Our emails can be found on our ITS Davis webpage. I'll take a moment here to thank my colleagues and co-presenters for today. Paco, congratulations. Dr. Alissa, Kendall.